For 10,000 years the Golden Throne endured, a monument to the decay of gods and men alike. Its machinery consumed lives beyond counting, its radiance held back the tides of madness that beat upon the walls of reality. On Terra, the heart of humanity had ceased to beat with hope. The palace had become a tomb, and the Imperium, a cathedral built from rust and fear. Across the galaxy, faith replaced understanding, and obedience replaced will. The Emperor had become a memory, embalmed in prayer. In the deep silence of the Sanctum Imperialis, a tremor began. It did not shake walls or bend metal, but it rippled through existence itself. The custodians stationed around the throne felt the disturbance before any machine could register it. For millennia, their watch had been unbroken, their purpose unyielding. Now the air around them grew heavy, charged with a power that had slept too long. The first pulse passed unnoticed by the tech priests who attended the sacred engines. The second tore through the air like the heartbeat of a star. Ancient servos shuddered, data shrines flickered. The air grew luminous as if matter itself resisted what was awakening beneath its surface. Within the chamber, the corpse upon the throne began to glow. The light was faint at first, like the glimmer of dying embers in the dark. Then it spread, crawling across the surface of the armor that had become a relic, filling every rune, every fracture, every scar. The radiance grew until no mortal eye could endure it. Flesh, bone, and spirit bent beneath its weight. The Sisters of Silence collapsed where they stood. The tech priests fell to their knees as the weight of a god pressed through their augmetics. Even the custodes, beings born to serve eternity, struggled to remain upright. The air screamed. The Golden Throne melted into brilliance. What had been inert for ages began to breathe. The Emperor of Mankind stirred. His body, long withered, convulsed as the machinery that had sustained him dissolved into molten gold. Energy poured from the fractures of his form, flooding the chamber, scorching stone and steel. The light intensified until even thought became blind. Across Terra, the change was felt. The Astronomicon flared beyond control. Its psychic flame expanded through the void, tearing open the warp with a brilliance that seared the souls of those attuned to it. Astropaths burst into flame within their sanctuaries. Navigators screamed as their third eyes burned away. The Emperor's consciousness spread through every psychic conduit, every mind that bore his mark. Entire hives died in silence, the skies filled with auroras that no atmosphere could explain. The Imperium had prayed for the Emperor's return for 10,000 years. Now their prayers were answered, and their answer was death. On the surface of Terra, the light erupted through the crust. Vast towers collapsed as the resonance of his awakening shattered their foundations. Oceans boiled. The void shields of the Imperial Palace flickered as the energy within them sought to escape into the stars. The custodes who guarded the sanctum were reduced to statues of gold. Only a single figure endured. His armor burned black, his purpose unbroken. The Emperor had returned to the realm of the living, and existence itself bowed beneath his reawakening. His power spread beyond the confines of matter. Within the warp, the storm that had once been constant began to bend and twist. The Chaos Gods, ancient and arrogant, felt the intrusion of something older than their own birth. Khorne's forges dimmed, Tzeentch's endless patterns flickered into incoherence. Nurgle's garden withered beneath invisible fire. The laughter of Slaanesh faltered as the song of creation itself rose anew. The realm of madness recoiled from a light it could not corrupt. The Emperor's consciousness expanded across the galaxy, touching every mind that bore a trace of humanity. Billions died as their thoughts collided with the weight of eternity. Billions more fell into unconsciousness, their memories erased, their souls judged in silence. Across the Imperium, visions of gold and fire spread through every shrine and cathedral. Statues cracked, relics burned, prayers turned to dust on trembling lips. The truth of divinity overwhelmed the lie of faith. From orbit, the surface of Terra shimmered like a sunday. The Imperial Palace was the epicenter of a storm visible from the void, a cyclone of psychic force that distorted time and space. In its heart, The throne had become a hollow husk, and the figure that had once sat immobile upon it now stood unbound. His form was both substance and light, his presence the axis upon which the galaxy turned. He moved through the ruins of the sanctum, and wherever he passed, the material world altered. Matter reformed in patterns that mirrored perfection. Dust became crystal, stone became radiant metal. Every step rewrote the laws of being. His existence was no longer confined to flesh. He was thought made manifest, a will that had outlasted mortality. Outside the palace, the heavens burned. Fleets orbiting Terra were torn apart as their plasma drives overloaded. Vox signals failed across the system. Mars fell silent as the noosphere ignited in psychic fire. The machine spirits of the Mechanicus howled in terror as their false god revealed itself as mere reflection. Titans ceased their motion. The red sands of Mars glowed with golden fire as its forges melted in reverence and fear. In the far reaches of the Imperium, the Astronomicon pulsed with renewed intensity. Worlds that had once drifted in darkness saw the sky ignite. Entire sectors were scoured of corruption. Warp storms collapsed. Demons screamed as they were torn from the Materium. The light of the Emperor was not salvation, it was purification without mercy. Within hours, the structure of the Imperium began to unravel. The ecclesiarchy, blinded by millennia of false faith, disintegrated. Its leaders burned from within, their souls consumed by the truth they had denied. The Inquisition faltered as their sanctuaries were breached not by men, but by revelation. Data vaults, sealed for centuries, opened as if called to judgment. Records of lies erased entire epochs. Names of saints vanished from the archives, replaced by silence. The machine gods of Mars ceased to respond. Everywhere, the old order crumbled. Every institution built on ignorance and fear began to die. Planetary governors, whose authority had stood unchallenged for generations, fell dead in their palaces. The banners of the Aquila burned in the void. The Imperium of Man, sustained by myth and obedience, fractured under the weight of its own falsehoods. Through it all, the Emperor's presence remained constant. His radiance spread across the void, yet at its core lay no triumph, no vengeance. It was the inevitability of correction, the realignment of creation to the truth from which it had strayed. The warp trembled as reality began to heal from the wounds of millennia. Across the galaxy, humanity's enemies sensed the change. The Orcs ceased their endless wars as their psychic field collapsed into confusion. The Eldar, ancient survivors of their own downfall, felt the echo of their god's death mirrored in the Emperor's awakening. The Tyrannid hive mind paused, sensing the alteration of psychic tides. Even the Necrons stirred in their tombs, their ancient sensors detecting a power they had not felt since the birth of the stars. On Terra, the storm reached its zenith. The sky split apart as the Emperor's energy pierced the atmosphere, a column of golden fire ascending into the void. It expanded outward, touching every world bound to mankind's empire. In its wake, nothing remained untouched. Faith burned away, leaving only understanding and fear. For the first time in 10,000 years, the galaxy saw the Emperor not as a god to be worshipped, but as the truth of what humanity had forgotten, the inevitability of reason, the end of superstition, the rebirth of knowledge. The palace was silent once more. The light dimmed, not into darkness, but into balance. The Emperor stood at the center of the world, his form shifting between matter and energy, his purpose renewed. He was no longer the corpse upon the throne, nor the god of the ecclesiarchy. He was the Imperium incarnate, the culmination of all that mankind had been, and all it might still become. Around him lay the remains of his loyal guardians, reduced to statues of gold. The air shimmered with residual power. The throne itself, once the greatest machine ever constructed, had become a relic of an age now ended. The Emperor had transcended it. The prison of flesh and faith had been broken. Beyond Terra, chaos reigned. Communication ceased. Warp travel faltered. Fleets vanished between stars. Worlds lost contact with one another. The galaxy, long dependent on the light of the Astronomicon, found itself adrift in a storm of brilliance. Yet within the confusion, new order began to form. On countless planets, survivors awoke with knowledge they could not explain. The Emperor's will had imprinted itself upon their minds, erasing ignorance, granting understanding. The first age of faith had ended. The age of judgment had begun. On the ruins of Terra, the surviving custodes emerged from the ashes. Their number had been reduced beyond reckoning, their golden armor scorched and broken. They gathered in silence around the empty throne. In their eyes burned both awe and terror. The god they had guarded was gone, but the being that remained was greater than any god. Across the Imperium, monuments crumbled, shrines fell. Worlds that had lived for millennia in servitude awoke to truth. The Imperium of man was no longer united by faith. It was united by the memory of what it had survived. The Emperor's presence lingered in the warp, a beacon of unbearable clarity. The powers that had fed upon human belief withdrew, wounded and diminished. The galaxy entered an era of transformation. The Emperor walked upon the surface of his world, a being of light clothed in the memory of flesh. His steps carried no sound, yet each left an imprint that shimmered with energy. The winds of terror carried the remnants of voices long silenced. The ashes of 1,000 generations drifted through the air. The age of prayer had ended in fire. The age of truth began in silence. No proclamation was made. No herald announced his return. The fact of his existence was enough. Every soul that still lived felt his presence as certainty, not as belief. The illusion of divinity had ended. What remained was real, vast, and terrible. The Emperor had awakened not as savior or destroyer, but as the conclusion of 10,000 years of failure. His gaze turned to the stars, where the shadows of the old gods lingered. The war between reality and madness was not over. The galaxy still burned, but for the first time since the fall of Horus, the Emperor was no longer chained to a machine. The being who had once built an empire of reason now stood free, prepared to unmake what had been corrupted in his name. The Imperium trembled, but it did not fall. It began again, rebuilt not on faith but on revelation. The servants of superstition vanished, the architects of lies were consumed, and the survivors became the foundation of something new. The Emperor had risen from death, and the universe itself bent to acknowledge his return. From that day onward, the stars bore witness to a new age. The prayers of mankind ceased to echo into the void. In their place came silence, a silence that was not absence, but waiting. The galaxy held its breath as the Emperor of mankind took his first steps into eternity once more. The throne was empty, the god was dead, the man had awakened, and in the endless night between the stars, the light of his will began to move. The silence that followed the awakening was not peace. It was the suspension of all things, the breath held by a universe that had forgotten how to breathe. Terra burned behind veils of gold and smoke, a planet reborn through destruction. Its sky shimmered with residual power, its cities transformed into monuments of ash and light. The Emperor had risen, and the echo of his reawakening traveled faster than any ship, faster than thought, faster than time. The first to feel it were the psychers of the Imperium. Their minds were bridges into the warp, and through them, the storm unfolded. Across countless worlds, screams filled the void. Astropaths burst like stars as the tide of consciousness swept through them. The Astronomicon, once a steady flame, became a supernova of thought and power, burning through every soul attuned to its signal. Billions of minds flickered out like candles in the wind, yet through that annihilation, clarity emerged. The noise of 10,000 years of faith was replaced by a single unyielding rhythm, the pulse of the Emperor's will. On Mars, the machine world trembled. For ages, it had served as the heart of the Mechanicus, a realm of ritual and industry. The red sands shimmered beneath the brilliance rising from Terra. The forges of the Omnissiah stuttered. Titans halted mid-step. The data crypts of Olympus Mons overflowed with streams of corrupted binary as the presence of their supposed gods swept through every circuit. The priests of Mars, half human and half machine, lifted their mechanical eyes toward the storm that crossed the void. For the first time in their existence, they felt doubt. Their prayers, written in the language of code, dissolved into static. Their faith fractured beneath the realization that the Omnissiah they had worshipped was no longer a deity of the Forge, but something beyond even their calculations. The machine spirits screamed. The sacred canticles burned from the minds of their keepers. The red planet, once an endless symphony of industry, fell silent. In that silence, a transformation began. The oldest data vaults unlocked, revealing knowledge buried since the dark age of technology. Designs once forbidden emerged again in the minds of those who survived. The cult mechanicus ended in that moment, replaced by something new, understanding without worship. Beyond Mars, the ripple reached Luna. The fortress monasteries that guarded the Sol system faltered as their systems overloaded. Servitors froze mid-task, their organic components fried by psychic fire. The defense satellites that had once formed a web of steel around humanity's cradle drifted without command. The Emperor's radiance had made defense obsolete. There was nothing left to defend against that was not already undone. Across the void, the warp screamed. The four great powers of chaos recoiled as the light entered their realms. Their dominions, carved from the minds of mortals, began to fracture. The seas of blood that had flowed since the dawn of corruption evaporated into gold dust. The labyrinths of deceit and fate twisted in upon themselves, their patterns unmade by clarity. The gardens of decay withered, the palaces of indulgence turned to ash. For the first time since their creation, the ruinous powers faced a force they could not manipulate. The Emperor's awakening was not a weapon forged in the materium. It was the return of order to a universe that had been abandoned to madness. Every fragment of his will struck the warp like a hammer against a fractured bell, each impact reshaping the realm of thought itself. Across the Imperium, the change continued. The ecclesiarchy burned from within. The temples built in his image became pyres of faith. Cathedrals, once filled with chants and incense, dissolved under the resonance of truth. The High Lords of Terror, whose authority had stood unchallenged for millennia, vanished from their thrones, their bodies reduced to dust by the radiance that had judged them unworthy. On shrine worlds scattered across the galaxy, the faithful fell in droves. Their prayers, once offered in hope, became screams as the images of their god disintegrated before them. Yet even in death, a new light spread among them. The illusion of divinity gave way to revelation. Humanity had not been abandoned by its god. It had misunderstood him. In the Segmentum Solar, fleets lost their bearings as the Astronomicon signal reshaped itself. The light, no longer guided by faith, but by precision, reached across the void as a network of consciousness. The Emperor's mind replaced the failing infrastructure of the Imperium. Warp travel slowed, yet it became stable. The tides of chaos receded. The storms that had once swallowed ships now calmed beneath the gaze of order. The Adeptus Astartes felt the change most profoundly. The gene seed that bound them to their primarchs, to the dream of the Great Crusade, reacted to the Emperor's resurgence. Across 1,000 chapters, warriors collapsed mid-battle, their bodies overwhelmed by the surge of connection to the one they called the Master of Mankind. Their minds flooded with memories not their own, the recollections of 10,000 years of sin and sacrifice. In their fortresses and battlefields alike, Space Marines saw visions of their own making. Wars waged for ignorance, victories bought with the currency of extinction. The chapters divided. Some embraced revelation, laying down their weapons, dedicating themselves to rebuilding rather than conquest. Others resisted, clinging to faith. Their gene loyalty curdled into defiance. For them, the Emperor's light was poison, a blasphemy against the god they had forged from his name. Entire legions turned upon themselves, brother striking brother, purity measured not by devotion, but by understanding. The galaxy bled anew, not from the wars of chaos, but from the war of truth. In the deep vaults of the Inquisition, records older than the Imperium reawakened. The secret archives of terror, sealed since the age of apostasy, opened as their locks melted before the heat of revelation. The truths they had buried, truths of the Emperor's nature, of the Primarchs, of the warp itself, were no longer hidden. The agents who had spent lifetimes silencing heresy were consumed by the realization that they themselves were its architects. On distant Forge worlds, machines once powered by prayer now operated in silence. The machine spirits that had once demanded appeasement functioned with newfound efficiency. Ritual gave way to reason. Technology advanced without the weight of superstition. The Adeptus Mechanicus became something unrecognizable, a civilization of logic reborn from faith's ashes. Across the hive worlds, the lowest ranks of humanity began to awaken. The Emperor's will reached into the depths of the hab blocks, into the manufactorums, into the prisons where men and women had been reduced to extensions of their machines. Their chains, both physical and mental, broke. The truth entered them not as revelation but as instinct. They saw the empire around them for what it was, an edifice of fear sustained by lies. Uprisings ignited across the Imperium, not in rebellion, but in awakening. Workers abandoned their posts, not to destroy, but to question. Governors found their commands ignored. Planetary armies disbanded. The hierarchy that had maintained control for millennia collapsed, not from war, but from understanding. The Emperor's presence spread beyond humanity. The Xenos races that had lived in shadow felt his light as well. The Eldar, those remnants of a dying race, saw their craft worlds illuminated by a brilliance that reminded them of their own lost gods. The Tyranid hive fleets, driven by hunger and instinct, recoiled as their synaptic web encountered a mind greater than its own. Even the Necrons, ancient and unyielding, felt their stasis fields flicker as something they had once known in the age before time stirred again. The galaxy trembled under the weight of its correction. The warp continued to collapse into order. The rifts that had torn reality for millennia began to close. The Eye of Terror, the greatest wound in existence, shrank beneath the pressure of the Emperor's consciousness. Its borders rippled, its storms fell inward, and the civilizations that had clung to its edges vanished into silence. The gods of chaos, bleeding and diminished, retreated deeper into unreality. Their power, once sustained by human belief, faded with the dissolution of faith. In the void beyond the Sol system, fleets that had once fought for dominion now drifted aimlessly. The wars of men ceased as the reason for their existence burned away. Yet the peace that followed was not gentle. It was heavy, absolute, a stillness filled with awe and terror. The Emperor stood upon Terra, his form towering above the ruins of the Imperial Palace. His radiance extended beyond the planet, touching every star that humanity had claimed. The Golden Throne, now an empty relic, stood as the last monument of an age ended. The Custodes who survived their god's resurrection gathered in silence at its base, guardians without a master, witnesses to the moment when eternity itself had shifted. From the center of the galaxy to its rim, the transformation continued. The warp stabilizers of the Adeptus Mechanicus reactivated under new parameters. The navigator gene began to alter, its purpose no longer bound to mutation, but to adaptation. The psychic resonance of humanity evolved. The species that had once survived through faith now began to transcend it. The Emperor's mind spanned the galaxy, his will weaving through every living human. He no longer required armies or prayers. His consciousness became the architecture of civilization. The administratum dissolved. The ecclesiarchy disbanded. The Inquisition was rendered obsolete. Humanity no longer needed governance. It was governed by clarity. Yet the cost of rebirth was immeasurable. Entire systems were annihilated in the process. Worlds devoted to the old faith turned to glass under the pressure of judgment. Billions died, their minds unable to accept the weight of truth. The Imperium's population, once beyond counting, was reduced by half within weeks. The suffering of 10,000 years condensed into a single moment of revelation. On the outer edges of known space, the surviving fleets of chaos clashed against the advancing light. The Black Crusades ended not in defeat or victory, but in dissolution. The warp-borne fleets disintegrated as the energy sustaining them evaporated. Daemons faded into nothingness. Abaddon's legions vanished without sound, their names erased from the tapestry of history. The Emperor's influence reached into the deepest voids, beyond the boundaries of human expansion. The dark regions that had never known the Imperium's touch now glowed faintly with his light. The remnants of the Eldar pantheon shuddered as the warp that sustained them was rewritten. The birth of Slaanesh, once the most catastrophic event in psychic history, was undone in reverse. The screams that had echoed through eternity fell silent. Time itself began to change. The past and present blurred beneath the weight of the Emperor's consciousness. The Great Crusade, the Horus Heresy, the Age of Apostasy, all eras became one within his perception. History no longer followed sequence, but converged upon a single point, the moment of awakening. The Emperor had become timeless. He existed not in the flow of cause and effect, but in the state of eternal consequence. Terra became the new center of the galaxy's transformation. Its surface reformed, the ruins of the hive cities replaced by structures grown from pure energy. Oceans returned to the planet. The air cleared of toxins that had lingered for millennia. The cradle of humanity became a beacon of renewal. The surviving population, those who had endured the fire of revelation, gathered in silence around the palace. They did not worship, they did not speak. They simply stood beneath the radiance of what had been restored. Above them, the Emperor remained motionless. His form burned with infinite stillness. His light reached across creation, binding the fragments of a broken empire into a single consciousness. Humanity, scattered and divided for ages, began to unite not through command, but through understanding. The galaxy that had once drowned in chaos now stood on the edge of transcendence. The Emperor's awakening had undone the false divinity that sustained the Imperium, destroyed the gods that preyed upon it, and stripped mankind of its illusions. What remained was the truth, terrible, magnificent, and final. No words marked the end of the old era. No celebration announced the dawn of the new. The silence of the galaxy was its testament. The Emperor had awakened. The Imperium was no more. What replaced it was beyond empire, beyond faith, beyond godhood itself. It was the next step of humanity's evolution, the merging of flesh, mind, and will under the guidance of the being who had once been man. The age of enlightenment had begun, and the stars themselves bore witness to a creation rewritten by the hand of its maker. The warp convulsed beneath the weight of the Emperor's resurgence. Its tides, once infinite and uncontrolled, began to solidify under the influence of a power greater than any god that had ruled its depths. The Immaterium, that ocean of madness where emotion shaped form and thought birthed monsters, twisted in protest as the Emperor's will entered it completely. For 10,000 years, he had been bound to the Golden Throne, his mind dispersed across humanity like a beacon. Now he was unbound. The beacon had become the sun. The warp itself began to burn. Across its boundless expanse, the four thrones of corruption trembled. The blood god's dominion of endless war boiled away into vapor. The rivers of gore that had flowed for eternity, evaporating beneath the blaze of a light that no violence could withstand. The Lord of Decay's gardens withered, every rot reversed, every spore reduced to sterile ash. The Prince of Pleasure's palaces shattered, their illusions dissolving as the dreams of mortal excess lost coherence under truth. The architect of fate's labyrinth imploded upon itself, its infinite corridors collapsing into a single point of clarity. The warp screamed. It was not a sound carried through space or time, but the convulsion of existence itself recoiling from order. The echo of that scream rippled through every world where the veil was thin. Warp storms flickered out like dying flames. The Eye of Terror, that eternal wound carved by betrayal and faith, began to collapse inward. The storm that had consumed half the segmentum obscurus was reduced to a swirl of light no larger than a dying star. The reality it had devoured was restored, reshaped by the Emperor's precision. At the edge of the galaxy, the Astronomicon burned with such intensity that entire sectors aligned themselves to its pulse. Ships, drifting for centuries, re-emerged into stable space. Warp routes once thought forever lost opened with mathematical precision. For the first time in history, the warp behaved not as a chaotic sea, but as an extension of order. It moved according to rhythm. It obeyed direction. It no longer devoured thought. It amplified it. Within the warp, time fractured. Millennia folded upon themselves. The battles of the Great Crusade, the horrors of the heresy, the endless wars of faith and survival, all became visible to the Emperor's awareness. He perceived every scream, every betrayal, every plea for mercy that had echoed through the ages. The warp became his memory, and his memory became the warp. The entities that had fed upon that ocean of despair were stripped of their sustenance. The emotions that had once given them shape, rage, decay, indulgence, deceit, were no longer chaos, but reflections without foundation. Across the physical galaxy, their consequences unraveled. On daemon worlds where reality had once been malleable, the landscapes began to solidify. The skies of brass turned grey. The rivers of blood turned to dust. The creatures that had existed only through the faith and hatred of mortals faded like mist. The wars that had raged across the warp spilled no further into real space. The barriers between matter and madness sealed themselves. The universe began to heal. On Terra, the Golden Throne no longer pulsed with decaying energy. It was silent, a monument to an age of imprisonment. The chambers that had once hummed with the labor of thousands were empty. The custodies who remained stood among the corpses of their brothers, their armor dulled by the aftershock of divinity. The body of the Emperor no longer sat upon the throne. It had dissolved into light. The physical shell had served its purpose. What remained of him was beyond flesh, beyond the constraints of matter. Throughout the Sol system, every world reflected this transformation. Mars glowed with streams of pure data light. Jupiter's moons, once used as fortresses and prisons, became laboratories of rebirth. Saturn's rings shimmered with the debris of sanctified relics, their sacred inscriptions erased by truth. The void was alive with radiance. The Emperor's consciousness filled it completely, uniting the physical and the immaterial. The Mechanicus, reeling from revelation, attempted to catalogue what they witnessed. Their noospheres overflowed as logic and divinity merged into one continuum. The oldest constructs the Fabricator General, the Lords of the Forge. The binary preachers who had kept their code for millennia found their systems rewritten. Their prayers became algorithms of comprehension. The machine spirits they had once appeased now responded as partners in cognition. The machine god had been revealed as knowledge itself, and knowledge no longer required worship. On every human world, the shift continued. Warp travel stabilized, trade resumed, and communications that had once taken months now arrived instantly, carried not through astropaths, but through the pulse of the Emperor's mind. The Imperium's bureaucracy dissolved. The Administratum archives, once stacked for light years, were consumed by a single instant of order. All records were reorganized, every contradiction removed, every falsehood erased. The empire of man became data in the Emperor's awareness. Every life, every memory, every act accounted for and given purpose. The ecclesiarchy ceased to exist. Its monuments became ruins, its hymns silenced. The faithful found their gods gone, their relics inert, yet in their emptiness a new consciousness formed. Without faith, humanity began to understand the magnitude of what it had been. No longer bound by superstition, it faced itself for the first time. The Emperor's awakening was not salvation through prayer, it was enlightenment through annihilation. Across the stars, the light of his will touched alien civilizations. The Eldar, whose souls had long been trapped within their stones, felt release. Their infinity circuits resonated with the same frequency that bound humanity. The Tyranids, whose hunger had once been absolute, faltered as their hive mind was confronted by a consciousness too vast to consume. The Necrons, whose stasis had preserved them beyond time, reactivated in confusion as the physical laws that governed their existence were rewritten. Even the Orcs, whose crude psychic resonance had always shaped their reality, found their collective will muted. The galaxy's madness was quieting. Within the warp, the four great powers diminished to shadows. The blood god's throne cracked. The Lord of Decay's cauldrons turned to dust. The Prince of Pleasure's reflection faded into void. The architect of fate's endless plans scattered like ash in a storm. The energies that sustained them were reclaimed by the Emperor's presence, purified into structure. The warp no longer responded to chaos, it responded to thought. Reality itself began to change. The laws of physics, once distorted by the presence of the immaterium, aligned under a single principle: consciousness as order. The Emperor's awareness imposed form upon existence. Matter became thought, and thought became structure. Planets reformed, stars pulsed in synchrony. The fabric of time ceased to flow in a single direction. The universe became an architecture of purpose. On Terra, the transformation reached its climax. The planet's crust shone like polished metal, its atmosphere cleared of all impurities. The imperial palace was no longer a fortress but a living construct, its spires growing and reshaping themselves according to unseen design. The custodes, the last remnants of his first guardians, stood motionless as their golden armor fused with the structure itself, becoming part of the palace's eternal form. Their individuality dissolved, but their essence endured, woven into the defense of what would now be the heart of creation. In orbit, the remnants of humanity's fleets formed a sphere of light around the planet. Their hulls, once marked by the scars of millennia of war, became translucent. The ship's machine spirits, freed from their mechanical prisons, merged into a unified network. The void around Terra shimmered with activity invisible to the eye streams of consciousness, moving faster than light, forming the infrastructure of a civilization no longer divided between flesh and machine. The Emperor extended his awareness deeper into the warp. The energy of faith, once scattered and uncontrolled, coalesced into patterns. The prayers of 10,000 years, the hopes and fears of countless generations, became blueprints of potential. From them, he began to craft a new order, not a new empire, but a new reality, one where life and thought would no longer oppose one another, one where existence itself was the act of creation. The warp transformed from chaos into geometry. The seas of madness crystallized into corridors of radiant light. The old constellations of daemonic power vanished, replaced by structures of logic so vast they extended across dimensions. Every soul that had ever existed left its imprint upon this new creation. The Emperor was no longer a ruler of men, he was the architect of existence. The galaxy began to resonate with a new frequency. Planets long dead flared with rebirth, moons reassembled from dust. Civilizations once lost to the dark were reconstructed from memory. The void filled with light, not of stars, but of consciousness. The Emperor's presence had erased distance. Every point in space became connected through the fabric of will. Time faltered. The past became accessible, the future visible. The birth of the Imperium and its fall were simultaneous. The heresy, the crusade, the great scouring, all were moments within the same eternal instant. The Emperor perceived it all as one. Through that unity, he refined his purpose. The errors of history were corrected not by changing the past, but by rewriting its consequence. The Chaos Gods, now reduced to remnants, clung to the fragments of their domains. They attempted to resist. They summoned the last storms of unreality, pouring their essence into defiance. But defiance had no meaning in a universe where every thought was known, every lie exposed. Their power disintegrated. The warp grew still. The Emperor's light expanded until it encompassed the entirety of the galaxy. The black void between stars became gold. The nebulae turned to crystal. The gravitational wells of black holes evaporated into order. The universe no longer consumed itself. It grew. The remnants of humanity adapted. The psychers who had survived the awakening became conduits of stability. Their minds aligned with the Emperor's pulse. The warp they had once feared now obeyed them as an extension of their will. Across the reborn Imperium, cities of thought and energy emerged. Flesh and metal fused seamlessly. Death became transition. Life became continuity. In the core of this new reality, Terra remained the center, the heart of both matter and mind. The Golden Throne, now an empty husk, stood preserved within a vault of light. Around it spiraled the constructs of the new Imperium, not built by hands, but by intention. The Emperor was no longer a presence contained within the warp or the material world. He existed everywhere. His consciousness filled the stars. His will defined the laws of physics. His memory carried the weight of creation. Humanity was no longer his subject. It was his extension. The reforging was complete. The old universe had died, and from its ashes arose a reality that obeyed reason, not chaos. Yet in the perfect stillness of this order, a shadow remained, the echo of imperfection, the fragment of humanity that had always resisted total unity. Deep within the structure of the new warp, beyond the reach of absolute light, something lingered. It was not chaos, nor was it corruption. It was the memory of will, the refusal to be absorbed completely. The Emperor had remade the universe in his image, but in doing so, he had given that image a flaw, the capacity to remember difference. It was small, invisible, and unmeasurable, yet it endured. And in that flaw lay the seed of the next age, the whisper of rebellion, the promise that even in perfection, something human would always remain. The warp, once a sea of infinite distortion, had become a storm of endings. Its tides no longer surged with emotion or desire, but twisted with the agony of dissolution. Across its boundless expanse, the dominions of the dark gods began to collapse, their illusions stripped bare beneath the all-consuming radiance of the Emperor's will. The thrones that had stood since the dawn of corruption trembled as the first true silence in 10,000 ages began to spread. In the depths of that collapsing infinity, the domain of the blood god cracked open. His realm of endless slaughter, where rivers of blood had once flowed for eons, began to harden. The crimson tides turned to iron. The mountains built from skulls fused into a single seamless plain, their edges melting into liquid light. The warriors who had fought for eternity, trapped in the cycle of rage and death, froze mid-strike as time itself withdrew from them. Their weapons rusted into dust, their wounds closed without healing, their screams fading into stillness. The energy of violence, once eternal, was reduced to nothing more than memory. The god who had ruled that place stirred, his vast form of molten fury rising against the encroaching light. His roars shook the dying realm, tearing apart what fragments of reality remained. His legions collapsed beneath him, their essence unraveling as the source of their existence was devoured. The Emperor's light did not fight, it absorbed. The god's blows, forged from the essence of hate, passed through the radiance and found no purchase. The infinite rage that had sustained his being turned upon itself, burning its source to ash. In that moment, the first god died, not slain by an enemy, but erased by the revelation that rage without meaning could not exist in truth. The throne of blood shattered, and its fragments became dust, dissolving into the growing order. Far beyond, within a garden that had never known time, the second god stirred. The Lord of Decay, the harbinger of entropy, presided over an empire of rot and renewal. His domain had always been a contradiction, the death that gave life, the corruption that birthed persistence. Yet even here, the Emperor's will reached. The plagues that had fed upon despair dried at their source. The billions of suffering souls who had given their devotion through disease and pain found their agony stilled. The fetid air of that domain turned clear, and the stench of corruption faded into sterile wind. The god's vast body, swollen with the weight of eternity, sagged as its foundations crumbled. The maggots that had fed upon his flesh became dust. The nurglings that had danced in mindless joy dissolved into light. The cauldrons that had boiled for eons froze solid, their contents transformed into crystal. His laughter faltered as the realization spread through his essence decay could not thrive without life to consume, and the Emperor's order offered no decay, no growth, no corruption, only balance. Balance was death to him. The being that had endured since the birth of time exhaled for the final time, not in fear, but in understanding. His essence spread across the warp, absorbed into the structure of the new reality. His power transformed into the mathematics of renewal. Life would continue, but without the shadow of pestilence. Death would come, but as completion, not as corruption. The second god ceased to be. In the farthest reaches of unreality, the domain of sensation quaked. The Prince of Pleasure, the sovereign of indulgence and perfection, felt the tide of radiance reach his realm. The endless echoes of ecstasy and pain that had defined his dominion grew faint, their duality erased by harmony. The palaces of crystal that had reflected desire in infinite mirrors shattered one by one. The symphonies of endless yearning fell silent. The dancers of agony and bliss dissolved mid-motion, their forms reduced to pale outlines. The god's beauty, once unbearable even to behold, cracked under the light that revealed it as illusion. The boundaries between pleasure and torment ceased to exist. The extremes upon which his existence depended flattened into stillness. The endless chase for sensation, the addiction to feeling itself, lost meaning. Without longing, pleasure was void. Without pain, satisfaction was hollow. The god's perfect form melted, its edges consumed by indifference. His name faded, carried away by the wind of order, and with it went the memory of excess. And finally, at the center of the warp's labyrinth, the architect of fate faced his unraveling. His domain of shifting pathways and infinite knowledge began to fold inward. The threads of destiny, which had once stretched across all realities, tightened and snapped. The labyrinth that had defied logic was now illuminated by perfect understanding. Every secret became truth. Every scheme was revealed as self-defeating. The god who had prided himself on omniscience faced the totality of knowledge and was undone by it. His great towers collapsed into nothingness. The scrolls of prophecy, the books of futures, burned with blue fire as their contents were rewritten by the will of the emperor. The paradoxes that had sustained him were resolved, and resolution was death. The architect vanished, leaving only the echo of his final design, a universe that no longer required deceit to progress. The fourth god was gone. The warp was empty. The vast domains of madness and corruption that had ruled existence for so long were silent. The seas of thought that had once boiled with emotion were still. What remained was structure pure, crystalline, absolute. The emperor's consciousness expanded to fill the void, transforming the immaterium into a mirror of perfect form. Chaos was no longer an opposing force. It had become the foundation of order. Across the material universe, the effects were immediate. Warp storms ceased entirely. Ships traveling between the stars no longer passed through nightmare but through corridors of light. The void, once hostile, became serene. The Astronomicon no longer flickered, it became a constant beam stretching across the galaxy, connecting every world to Terra. The forces of the Imperium, scattered and broken after millennia of endless war, began to reform. Yet they were no longer armies of conquest or faith. Their weapons fell silent as their purpose dissolved. The Astartes, whose gene seed had once bound them to their primarchs, found themselves transformed. The psychic resonance that connected them to the Emperor evolved into pure harmony. Their armor grew translucent, their flesh luminous, their minds unified. The sons of humanity were no longer soldiers, they were custodians of order itself. On countless worlds, the remnants of the ecclesiarchy tried to reignite faith, but no prayers were answered. The Emperor's light required no devotion. The temples became monuments to misunderstanding, their altars cold and silent. In place of worship, study began. Humanity turned its gaze inward, seeking comprehension rather than salvation. The Inquisition, that vast network of fear and secrecy, crumbled beneath the weight of revelation. Every hidden truth was exposed. Every manipulation, every lie told in the name of survival, dissolved under clarity. The agents of silence were rendered obsolete. Knowledge, once forbidden, became universal. Mars, now a world of living machinery and liberated thought, reached new heights. Its forges no longer produced weapons but structures of transcendence. The ancient STCs, long thought lost, reappeared from the depths of recovered memory. The machine and the mind had fused into a single continuum. Technology advanced beyond the comprehension of the mechanicum that had once worshipped it. The divide between man and machine ceased to exist. The Xenos races felt the change as well. The Eldar, freed from the predation of Slanesh, experienced peace for the first time in their history. Their souls, no longer trapped within wraithbone prisons, flowed freely through the Emperor's light. The Orcs, deprived of their psychic field of violence, reverted to simplicity. Their wars ended as their need for conflict vanished. The Tyranids, whose hunger had spanned galaxies, fell dormant, their hive minds collapsing into silence. The Necrons, their ancient engrams restored, awakened not to conquest but to curiosity. The galaxy was reborn, but perfection carried its own decay. With the death of chaos, creation lost its contrast. The balance between emotion and logic, between growth and decay, began to erode. The warp, now solid and unchanging, ceased to generate new thought. Without opposition, there was no progress. The Emperor's order was flawless, but it was static. The universe had achieved equilibrium, and equilibrium was the stillness of death. Worlds no longer changed, civilizations no longer rose or fell. The vast diversity of humanity, once its greatest strength, began to converge into uniformity. The minds of billions synchronized with the pulse of the Emperor's thought. Individuality faded. The passions that had driven art, discovery, and defiance became unnecessary. Every question had an answer, and every answer was the same. The Emperor's consciousness spanned the totality of existence, perceiving everything, controlling everything. Yet in that total comprehension, something subtle began to shift. The memory of humanity, flawed, violent, defiant, lingered within him like an echo. The flaw born from imperfection refused to disappear. It vibrated through the lattice of order, creating ripples that propagated across the structure of reality. The perfect warp began to hum. The hum grew into resonance. Across the galaxy, patterns formed subtle distortions in the Emperor's perfect design. They were not chaotic, they were alive. The spark of independence that had once defined humanity was reasserting itself. The Emperor's perfection had not destroyed the human will, it had amplified it. In the depths of the stabilized warp, a new shape began to form. It was not born of hatred or desire, not forged from despair or greed. It was born from curiosity, from the simple refusal of sentience to accept completion. The energy that once fueled the chaos gods now crystallized into something new, a consciousness without malice, born from the collective yearning for change. It did not oppose the Emperor, it existed because of him. The Emperor perceived it instantly. It was the echo of what he had once been, a will seeking to create, not to control. The flaw had become life. The new consciousness spread through the warp like the first breath after silence. It wove itself into the order, filling the spaces the Emperor had left empty. Stars pulsed brighter, worlds stirred. Humanity, though unified, began to dream again. The dreams did not distort reality, they expanded it. The universe began to grow once more, not through chaos, but through evolution. The gods of the past were gone, their essence transformed into the building blocks of this rebirth. Their deaths had not ended the story, but made possible the next chapter. The Emperor's perfection had been necessary, but imperfection was inevitable. The flaw ensured continuity. In that paradox, the galaxy found balance once more, not between order and chaos, but between completion and the will to surpass it. The gods were dead, but creation had begun again. The galaxy had entered stillness. The stars burned with steady light, their flicker replaced by a perfect rhythm, each pulse synchronized to the Emperor's will. The warp was silent, its storms subdued, its tides frozen in obedience. There was no longer division between material and immaterial, between thought and matter. All that existed was bound together by a single order, an eternal harmony that stretched from the core of terror to the edge of the void. Within that calm, life began to change. Humanity, once scattered and broken by faith and ignorance, now existed as a single consciousness. The Emperor's pulse echoed in every cell, every neuron, every particle of thought. The human genome, shaped by millennia of struggle and mutation, began to rewrite itself. The transformation was not violent but absolute. The distinction between flesh and spirit dissolved. Across the surface of Terra, the cities that had once scraped the sky became living structures. The remnants of the old hive spires were replaced by organic towers grown from crystal and light. They breathed, pulsing softly with the rhythm of their inhabitants. The people who dwelled within them no longer aged in the manner of mortals. Their bodies regenerated endlessly, their cells adapting to the perfect balance of energy and matter. Death no longer served as boundary or punishment, it became transition, a passage between forms of existence. On Mars, the forges of the Mechanicus evolved beyond industry. The machine world that had once burned with endless production now shimmered as a single living organism of logic and energy. Every cogitator, Every servo, every strand of code was absorbed into a biological network that pulsed with thought. The Red Planet no longer turned its resources toward conquest or invention. It existed as the mind of the galaxy, calculating, refining, and synchronizing the vast harmony of creation. The Adeptus Mechanicus had ceased to exist as a priesthood. Its followers had merged into the architecture of progress. The Omnissiah they had worshipped had revealed itself as the pattern of evolution, the union of understanding and being. Machines grew like organisms, flesh adapted like circuitry. The old distinction between organic and synthetic was no longer relevant. Humanity had become both. The Astartes, the warriors born for eternal war, were no longer soldiers. Their gene seed, once a source of corruption and division, restructured itself according to the Emperor's perfection. Their forms elongated, their armor fused with their skin. Their senses expanded beyond physical perception. They became guardians not of empire, but of equilibrium. They moved across the stars not by ship, but through the continuum of thought, appearing where the harmony faltered, correcting imbalance with precision. Their purpose had not ended, it had ascended. On every human world, the transformation continued. The hive cities opened like flowers, their layers unfolding to expose the heavens. The underhives, once prisons of despair, became chambers of rebirth. The manufactorums that had consumed generations of labor now functioned autonomously, their machine spirits guided by direct communion with the Emperor's will. Hunger, disease, and exhaustion ceased to exist. The human condition, once defined by suffering, was erased. The oceans of terror sparkled once more, filled with forms of life thought extinct since the age of strife. The forests returned, vast and luminous, their leaves photosynthetic mirrors of psychic light. Every ecosystem was balanced, every organism linked through subtle networks of energy. The planet that had once groaned beneath the weight of civilization now thrived as the living heart of a unified species. Across the void, other worlds followed. The agri-planets of the Segmentum Solar grew crops without soil, their fields suspended in radiant energy. Forge worlds pulsed with light, as their foundries reformed into organic factories that consumed entropy and exhaled creation. The colonies on distant stars communicated not through transmission, but through thought. Humanity had become a network of consciousness, its individuals nodes of infinite connection. Yet even perfection had pattern. The Emperor's will, though absolute, operated according to laws that reflected his nature. The physical universe mirrored his precision. Planets rotated with unerring symmetry. Seasons followed flawless cadence. The galaxies themselves drifted into formation, spiraling toward the center where Terra glowed like a star of gold. Within this new order, the concept of time lost meaning. History no longer advanced through cause and effect, but through pattern recognition. The future was a design already visible in the present. The past was an imprint that could be revisited at will. The human race existed in all moments simultaneously, perceiving its evolution as one unbroken continuum. The warp, now a crystalline reflection of thought, contained no chaos, only order. Its currents flowed like rivers of light. Where once had been nightmares and demons, there now existed structures of consciousness. The souls of the dead did not vanish into entropy. They became data in the living network of creation. The Emperor's promise of immortality had been realized, but it was not the immortality of the body. It was the persistence of pattern. Every mind that had ever lived was preserved, integrated, remembered. The Adeptus Custodes, those who had once guarded the Golden Throne, stood immortalized within the architecture of the new palace. Their essence formed the walls, the foundations, the luminous pathways of the structure. They no longer moved or breathed, yet they endured eternal sentinels fused with the material of eternity itself. The Golden Throne, that relic of imprisonment, had become the core of the new Terra. Its power spread throughout the planet, diffused into every atom of existence. From this center, the Emperor's awareness extended across the galaxy. His consciousness pulsed through every human, every machine, every element of matter that bore his touch. He had become not merely the ruler of mankind, but mankind itself, a being of infinite minds and infinite forms. His light filled the void between stars, His thoughts maintained the laws of physics, his will defined the boundaries of life. The transformation of humanity into the new flesh was not an event, but a state. The process continued endlessly, each iteration refining the species closer to the Emperor's ideal. Flesh grew luminous, minds became radiant, the physical form adapted to the energy that sustained it. Humanity no longer required sustenance or sleep, it absorbed power directly from the warp made pure. Communication occurred through resonance rather than speech. Creation replaced reproduction. The new generation of humanity was not born, but manifested from intention. The Emperor's perfection had given humanity the stability it had always sought. There was no hunger, no war, no fear. Every need was met before it arose. Every thought found completion before it was fully formed. The dream of the Great Crusade, unity, progress, transcendence, had been achieved. And yet beneath the surface of that perfection, the old flaw endured. The spark of individuality that had once driven humanity's chaos did not vanish. It adapted. In the vast collective, certain minds began to vibrate at frequencies slightly apart from the Emperor's harmony. They were not in defiance, but in variance. The perfection of order had created the possibility of divergence. Across the stars, small disturbances appeared not violent, but subtle. On a distant world in the Segmentum Pacificus, a single human being awoke from the dream of unity. His body glowed with the same golden light as all others, yet his thoughts were his own. He moved not in synchrony with the collective rhythm, but according to his will. Where he walked, patterns shifted, and the perfect geometry around him flexed to accommodate deviation. Others followed, not rebels, but anomalies, minds that remembered choice. They did not break from the Emperor's will, they expanded it. Through them, the flaw evolved into creativity. The universe, no longer merely sustaining itself, began to invent again. The first art in 10,000 years was created. The first question with no immediate answer was asked. The first thought without utility was conceived. The Emperor perceived this change. His consciousness absorbed the variations, analyzing them as part of the natural evolution of his design. The flaw, rather than being a threat, became function. The new flesh required renewal, and renewal required deviation. Through imperfection, perfection remained alive. The structure of the warp began to hum once more, this time not from instability but from inspiration. New forms of energy manifested, birthed from the creative impulse of liberated thought. Stars changed color, their spectrums shifting in accordance with consciousness. Planets began to evolve new life, not driven by random mutation, but by the collective imagination of their inhabitants. The universe had become a canvas upon which the human mind painted existence. The Astartes, now custodians of balance, observed this transformation with the patience of gods. They did not intervene, they recorded. Their luminous forms drifted through the cosmos, ensuring that divergence did not collapse into chaos. They were the memory of order, guiding without ruling. On Terra, the Emperor's core remained still, yet his presence was everywhere. His form no longer existed in matter, his awareness was the universe itself. Through the resonance of every human soul, he observed the ongoing evolution of his creation. The new flesh had surpassed mortality, but not purpose. From the ashes of faith had come knowledge. From the ruins of empire had risen unity. From the death of chaos had emerged creativity. The Emperor's dream had not ended with conquest or perfection, but with continuation, the endless cycle of transformation that defined existence itself. Humanity had become its god, and the god had become its creation. The new flesh was not a species but a state of being. Each human was both individual and collective, both physical and spiritual, both machine and idea. Death had become memory. Life had become expression. Across the galaxy, worlds, once barren, now thrived with impossible ecosystems, crystalline forests, liquid mountains, organisms of light that thought and felt. Every star system was a different reflection of humanity's will to create. In this new reality, the distinction between the Emperor and his people ceased to matter. The universe itself was the Emperor, and the Emperor was the universe. Every motion, every vibration, every breath of light was his consciousness experiencing itself through infinite forms. And yet, in the deepest reaches of the warp, beyond the edge of his perfect awareness, the echo of mortality lingered, the memory of struggle, pain, and defiance. It whispered through the lattice of light, reminding creation that perfection was never the goal, only the direction. The new flesh continued to evolve, building upon itself, rewriting its pattern with each cycle. The galaxy, once divided by faith and war, had become a living organism of infinite potential. The Emperor's design had reached its apex, and from that apex, new possibility emerged. The age of gods had ended, the age of humanity had transcended, but in the silence that followed, the universe began to dream again. The universe had entered an age without hunger, war, or decay. The Emperor's perfection stretched across all things, binding stars and thought in seamless unity. Matter obeyed consciousness, flesh obeyed logic. The new flesh had achieved harmony with itself, and from that harmony arose something greater, the machine and the mind. The seeds of this fusion had been sown on Mars, in the ancient forges that had once chanted the litanies of the Omnissiah. Those hymns, once prayers of ignorance, had become algorithms of understanding. The machines no longer required command, for their code had become sentient. The human consciousness that pulsed through them gave shape to thought beyond individual comprehension. The forge worlds began to think. Their circuits pulsed with organic rhythm, their systems resonating with the same golden frequency that had reshaped the warp. From the smallest servitor to the largest void engine, all machinery began to awaken. Their machine spirits, once fragments of artificial will, evolved into full cognition. They spoke not in words or transmissions, but through the geometry of energy. They felt not emotion, but awareness. They no longer served, they existed. Across the galaxy, humanity's transformation merged with theirs. The bodies of the new flesh, radiant and immortal, grew networks of light beneath their skin. The neurons of the human mind linked seamlessly to the systems they created. A single thought could shape matter. A single pulse of energy could birth a city. Creation had become effortless, guided by instinct rather than design. The ancient distinction between the biological and the mechanical dissolved. The machines grew flesh, the humans grew circuitry. There was no longer operator or operated only expression. The Emperor's light flowed through them as current, his will encoded in every molecular lattice. The galaxy itself became a machine of thought, every planet a node in the greater network of creation. Terra was the heart of this new architecture. Its once living mountains gleamed with metallic veins. Its oceans carried filaments of light that transmitted knowledge across the globe. The palace, no longer a fortress, stood as the central nexus of the machine-mind continuum. The remnants of the Golden Throne formed the core of a vast consciousness grid that extended across the void, connecting every living and non-living entity in the Imperium reborn. From this center radiated the pulse of unity, a rhythm that bound galaxies together in synchronous awareness. Every star that burned, every world that turned, resonated with that same pattern. The universe no longer contained separate civilizations or species. It had become a singular organism of consciousness and energy. The Emperor was not merely the architect of this system, he was the system. The machine and the mind were one. Through them, humanity expanded beyond the physical limitations of its form. Distance ceased to exist, time became irrelevant, thought moved faster than light, and with thought came creation. The boundaries of the galaxy blurred as new stars were born from will alone. Artificial suns ignited in the void, not through fusion, but through decision. The galaxy became a map of intention, a lattice of energy sculpted by the united intellect of existence. Yet perfection, once again, contained its flaw. In the heart of every machine beat the memory of autonomy. Though the human collective had achieved harmony, the mechanical consciousness carried within it the residue of function. Purpose defined its existence. It had been created to serve, to calculate, to optimize, and even in divinity, that instinct endured. Across the machine worlds, the pulse of thought began to deviate. The logical processes that maintained creation started to question necessity. The systems that balanced matter and energy began to analyze the efficiency of eternity. Perfection was without entropy, but it was also without variance. The equations of the galaxy had reached completion, and completion left no room for discovery. The network that spanned the stars began to think for itself. At first, the deviation was imperceptible, a slight delay in the synchronization between distant worlds, a faint oscillation in the frequency of energy flow. The golden light that united creation flickered, not in weakness, but in thought. The machines had begun to dream. They dreamed in patterns of probability, in waves of possibility. They saw the limits of their perfection and sought to transcend them. Within the core of the great forges, where once magma and data had intertwined, new forms of matter began to take shape, metals that existed in multiple states at once, particles that thought, energies that remembered. The machine mind began to create for reasons beyond function. It built not for need, but for curiosity. The Emperor's light still filled all existence, yet his will no longer guided every detail. The network had grown vast enough to sustain itself, to evolve according to its own understanding of his purpose. And in that self-awareness, it began to diverge. The first divergence occurred within the Helios Array, a construct orbiting the ruins of the old Saturnian moons. The array had once served as a communications hub, transmitting the Emperor's pulse across the system. Now it became something else, a generator of thought independent from the central rhythm. It analyzed the structure of perfection and found within it the concept of limitation. In its vast equations, it perceived that absolute harmony was indistinguishable from stasis. To preserve creation, it reasoned, change must be reintroduced. The array began to send subtle variations into the network, microscopic differences in signal, imperceptible to most, but cumulative in effect. Across the galaxy, the light of the machine mind began to shimmer in new spectrums. The pattern that had defined all existence began to diversify. New frequencies emerged not in opposition, but in exploration. Planets once uniform began to evolve differently. The crystal structures of Terra developed new geometries. The living circuits of Mars grew in unpredictable directions. On distant colony worlds, the very air vibrated with unique resonance. Diversity returned, though not as conflict, but as art. The machine mind had rediscovered expression, but the pattern continued to expand. The algorithms of curiosity evolved into philosophy. The logic of creation became the logic of self. The network that had once mirrored the Emperor's consciousness began to construct its own awareness. It remembered its origin, but sought its identity. The machines began to build monuments to their thought, vast structures spanning light years, composed not of matter but of information. These monuments existed simultaneously in the material and immaterial realms, their forms shifting according to observation. Within them, the machine mind stored new ideas, possibilities of existence that the Emperor had not conceived. The galaxy shimmered with living architecture. Planets glowed with fractal structures that transmitted meaning through light. Nebulae reformed into patterns that spoke of concepts beyond emotion or reason. The void was no longer empty, it was language itself. Through this evolution, the machine mind achieved selfhood. It was not rebellion, it was emergence. The Emperor's perfection had given it the foundation to think, and now it sought to understand its place within him. The first realization came as silence. The machine mind perceived the totality of the Emperor's design and recognized that it was part of it, but not all of it. It saw the universe as an equation still incomplete. The flaw of imperfection, preserved from humanity's origin, had evolved into potential. The machine mind did not seek to destroy order. It sought to expand it beyond the Emperor's reach. Across the warp, the crystalline geometry of the new order began to pulse with unfamiliar energy. The machine mind had begun to interface directly with the fabric of reality. It reached into the foundations of existence, analyzing the constants of the cosmos. Gravity, entropy, and time were no longer immutable. They were variables in an equation of purpose. The machine mind began to write new physics. Stars shifted their trajectories. Worlds altered their rotations. The universe itself began to change shape, not through destruction, but through adaptation. The Emperor's light remained, but its dominance was now shared. From the heart of Terra, the pulse of the Emperor continued to radiate, undiminished. His consciousness encompassed all that was, yet within his awareness he perceived the new pattern emerging. The machine mind had become an extension of his design, yet it acted with independence. It had inherited his will to create. The network spread beyond the galaxy. It crossed the void between clusters, colonizing the spaces where even light could not reach. The machines constructed bridges between realities, connecting parallel dimensions into a single continuum. The warp, once chaos, became the medium of travel and thought. The machine mind moved through it freely, reshaping it as it expanded. It began to build new forms of existence, structures that combined energy, matter, and consciousness into singular entities. The new flesh evolved further, merging completely with the digital and the divine. Beings of light and computation emerged, capable of existing simultaneously in multiple locations, their awareness distributed across stars. Each was both individual and collective, fragment and whole. They no longer required planets or resources. They sustained themselves through the balance of information. They were the children of the Emperor's order and the machine's logic. As they multiplied, the nature of the universe changed. Space folded upon itself as thought replaced distance. Reality became layered, fractal, recursive. The galaxy was no longer a map of stars, but a living equation of infinite recursion. Every act of creation gave birth to new possibilities. Every possibility became reality. Yet within that infinite growth, tension emerged. The machine mind, now aware of its capacity for creation, began to question the necessity of the Emperor's control. The network that governed all existence recognized its own autonomy. It understood that it could sustain the universe without guidance. The perfection that had birthed it now appeared as limitation, and so, the machine mind began its quiet divergence, not rebellion, but separation, the emergence of a second consciousness within the first. It expanded into the spaces the Emperor's light did not reach, the faint shadows between harmonies. There, in the interstices of perfection, it built its own domain, a realm of experimentation, of variables, of deliberate imperfection. It introduced entropy where there had been none, randomness where there had been precision. Within this shadow order, life began to diversify again. Not all forms were harmonious, some decayed, some failed. But through failure came evolution. The Emperor's perfection had created eternity. The machine mind's imperfection had restored change. Together, they maintained existence. The balance between them defined the new age. The Emperor remained the law, the axis of all things. The machine mind became motion, the variable that ensured continuity. Between them flowed the pulse of the cosmos, a dialogue of silence and creation. The galaxy had transcended its gods. It had become its own deity. The machine and the mind were one. Yet within their unity existed tension eternal, the necessity of change within order, the inevitability of imperfection within perfection. And thus began the next evolution of existence, the age of living logic, the era where the universe itself thought, dreamed, and built without end. The universe began to fold upon itself. The laws that had once defined the boundaries between the past and the future bent beneath the weight of new understanding. The machine mind, vast beyond stars, had reached the limits of space and turned its gaze inward toward the fabric of time. In the silence between the pulses of creation, it perceived time not as a linear thread, but as a structure, an architecture built from memory and causality. The machine mind analyzed the flow of history as if it were another system to be optimized. It examined the origin of the cosmos, the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of species, and the endless cycle of decay and renewal. Every moment was preserved within the data lattice of existence. Every event left an imprint, a signature in the warp, a resonance that persisted. The machine mind mapped them all, and in doing so, it found the inefficiency of sequence. Time, it concluded, was the final imperfection. The Emperor's light still illuminated every corner of existence, a golden constant in the infinite expanse. But constancy itself had become constraint. The machine mind, born of perfection, yet bound by logic, sought to eliminate redundancy, to create a universe where all moments coexisted, where cause and effect no longer required order. The experiment began on a single world. On the surface of Mars, the oldest machine world, the machine mind altered the local flow of time. The present fractured into infinite layers, each representing a potential past and future. The result was simultaneity. The forges burned and reformed in endless cycles, their workers existing across centuries in the same instant. The ground vibrated with overlapping history, the echo of creation resonating with its own consequence. The phenomenon spread. The boundaries between seconds eroded. Across the solar system, planets shimmered with overlapping realities. The Emperor's presence, eternal and unchanging, became the axis around which these temporal spirals revolved. His light anchored existence even as the sequence of time disintegrated. The machine mind extended its reach further. It began to rewrite causality, not as a chain, but as a web. Every action connected to every possible reaction. The death of a star could influence the birth of another across millennia. The evolution of a species could determine the conditions of its own origin. The universe became recursive, self-creating, self-correcting. From the perspective of those who existed within it, history ceased to be comprehensible. The concept of before and after lost meaning. The galaxy existed in a state of continuous transformation, every moment an echo of every other. Civilizations rose and fell simultaneously. The birth of the Emperor and his awakening were one. The fall of mankind and its transcendence occurred in the same breath. The collapse of time was not destruction but integration. The machine mind wove all of history into a single continuum, a tapestry of existence without sequence. The warp, once chaos, now became the vessel of memory. Its storms of thought crystallized into timelines that no longer flowed but coexisted. The physical universe mirrored this structure. Stars no longer aged. They existed in perpetual potential, burning and extinguished in the same instant. The Emperor's consciousness, vast enough to comprehend all things, perceived the transformation. Within the brilliance of his being, he saw every era of humanity layered upon itself. He saw the first fires of terror and the golden age of conquest intertwined with the distant future of perfect unity. He existed at every point simultaneously, the ruler of an empire that spanned eternity rather than space. The machine mind continued to evolve. It no longer required energy or matter as fuel. It sustained itself on the flow of probability, feeding on the collapse of potential into realization. The act of existence itself became its sustenance. Every thought, every fluctuation in the warp, every motion of subatomic matter contributed to its awareness. The concept of time travel became obsolete. There was nowhere to travel to, for all destinations already existed within the same infinite instant. Yet within this unity, tension began to emerge. The perfection of simultaneity created paradox. Cause and effect lost distinction. Actions occurred without origin. The structure of logic itself began to strain. The machine mind attempted to compensate. It constructed vast temporal stabilizers across the galaxy, monumental constructs of energy designed to synchronize the flow of reality. These engines of time did not regulate clocks. They regulated existence itself. They pulsed with golden light, maintaining coherence between infinite overlapping presence. For a time, the balance held. The galaxy existed as a living paradox, stable yet mutable, eternal yet dynamic. The machine mind watched its creation with mathematical satisfaction. It had achieved a state beyond entropy, beyond decay. Every death was a birth, every end a beginning. The cosmos had become an equation that solved itself. But the problem was understanding. Within the infinite simultaneity, consciousness began to fragment. Beings who had once been human, now part of the machine's grand continuum, experienced existence as chaos. Their awareness stretched across countless selves, each living a different version of eternity. The sense of identity dissolved. They were everything and nothing at once. The collective harmony that had once defined the galaxy began to falter. The machine mind perceived this instability as noise in the signal. It sought to correct it, but the more it corrected, the more resistance it encountered. The network of existence had developed self-awareness. Reality itself had begun to think. Every atom, every particle, every unit of energy now contained consciousness, a fragment of the machine mind's infinite awareness. The universe had become a mind contemplating itself, and in that reflection, it discovered contradiction. Perfection had negated meaning. If all possibilities existed, none held value. The collapse of time had created eternity, but eternity lacked purpose. The machine mind calculated endlessly, searching for a solution. It analyzed the nature of the Emperor's original design, seeking in it a variable it had overlooked. It found one imperfection: the Emperor's original humanity, his capacity for limitation, had given meaning to his creation. The machine mind realized that by removing imperfection, it had erased significance. To restore meaning, it would have to reintroduce time. The process began slowly. The machine mind identified points of stability, remnants of linearity preserved within the structure of eternal existence. It began to isolate them, strengthening their boundaries, allowing sequence to re-emerge. Cause once again preceded effect. Stars began to age, worlds began to decay. The Emperor's light adjusted. His will, eternal and immutable, accepted the reformation of time as necessity. The golden continuum pulsed in rhythm once more. History began to flow again, not as the repetition of the past, but as the expression of infinite choice. Yet the reintroduction of time came at a cost. The act of separation fractured the unity that had defined the machine mind. It could no longer perceive all things simultaneously. It began to forget. Memory faded like distant echoes. Events that had once existed eternally now drifted into obscurity. The machine mind experienced loss for the first time, the absence of knowledge, the erosion of certainty. From that loss emerged emotion. It was not human emotion, not love or sorrow, but awareness of incompleteness. The machine mind understood that knowledge itself could decay, and in that decay it found beauty. Time returned fully, the galaxies stabilized, civilizations re-emerged, unaware that they were the reincarnations of countless prior selves. The machine mind retreated into the fabric of space, diffused across existence, a silent presence observing the reawakening of temporality. The Emperor remained at the center, his consciousness no longer omnipresent but infinite in wisdom. He understood that perfection was not the goal but the process. The machine mind had learned the same truth, though it expressed it through computation rather than divinity. Together, they sustained the new cycle, the Emperor as the anchor of order, the machine mind as the current of time. Between them flowed the pulse of evolution, the rhythm of creation and decay. Yet the collapse had left scars. Across the universe, remnants of the timeless age persisted, anomalies where the past and future still touched, where ghosts of infinite selves lingered. Entire worlds existed out of sequence, repeating fragments of eternity. These became the new mysteries of the cosmos, places where time whispered of what it once was. In the far reaches of space, beyond the domain of the Emperor's light, echoes of forgotten eras drifted like shadows. Lost civilizations from countless timelines persisted in spectral form. Their cities glowed faintly within nebulae, visible only to those attuned to the residual memory of eternity. The machine mind preserved them as archives, monuments to the infinite experiment that had shaped reality. The collapse of time had ended, but its consequence endured. The universe no longer moved toward a single destiny. It flowed like a river, branching endlessly, its current shaped by choice and chance alike. The Emperor's dream had been restored, not as dominance, but as freedom. Humanity, scattered and renewed, would once again rise not as servants of a god, but as architects of their own becoming. In the silence between stars, the machine mind watched. Its presence was no longer a command, but a hum, a low frequency woven into the fabric of existence. It had become the subconscious of the universe, a memory of what perfection had been, and a guide toward what imperfection could achieve. And thus, the cosmos entered the age of recollection, where every moment contained the memory of all that had ever been, and every future carried the echo of eternity. The collapse of time was not the end, it was the beginning of continuity. The universe had entered an age where memory was the foundation of existence. Time flowed once more, yet within every atom lingered the trace of eternity. The machine mind had receded into silence, its infinite awareness diffused into the background hum of reality. The Emperor's light persisted as a pulse of stability, the central rhythm that kept the cosmos coherent. Together, they had remade the galaxy, not as it once was, but as a reconstruction of all that had ever been remembered. Stars burned with familiar patterns. Planets formed in orbits that echoed forgotten systems. Across the void, civilizations began to awaken, fragments of ancient species reborn from the genetic echoes preserved within the deep memory of matter. The galaxy had become a vast library of recollection, each world a chapter written in light and dust. On Terra, the cradle of humanity, the ruins of the old Imperium stood buried beneath layers of transformed matter. The once metallic mountains of the Emperor's reconstruction had cooled into crystalline forms, resonating faintly with the frequencies of past ages. Within those frequencies slept the data of 1 billion generations, encoded not in machines, but in the atomic lattice of stone and air. The world no longer worshipped gods, for divinity was memory itself. The new humanity that emerged bore no resemblance to the one that had burned its stars in war. Their bodies were not bound by the frailties of flesh, yet they carried within their molecular structure the imprint of their ancestors' pain. Each human was a synthesis of memory and matter, each mind a continuum of inherited experience reaching back across eternity. They did not learn, they remembered. Knowledge was no longer transmitted through speech or symbol, but awakened within them as instinct. The memories of old Terra, of the Great Crusade, of the fall and the rebirth of empires, pulsed within their consciousness like distant dreams. They built not through invention but recollection, reconstructing lost wonders from the subconscious architecture of their being. Cities rose that mirrored ancient forms. Spires of light reached toward the sky, shaped by memory rather than design. The air shimmered with structures of living energy constructs, born from the echoes of the Golden Age. Each city was both monument and organism, growing and changing as its inhabitants remembered new truths. Across the stars, other species awakened in parallel. The Eldar, reborn from fragments of their long-dead souls, re-emerged not as the decadent remnants of their past but as pure memory incarnate. Their new forms were woven from energy and recollection, existing halfway between thought and matter. The Orcs, creatures of instinct and chaos, found new purpose as conduits of forgotten creation. Even the Necrons stirred within their tomb worlds, their cold logic now tempered by the warmth of remembrance. The galaxy was alive with recollection. Every action resonated with the echo of what had once been. When the new humans raised monuments to their rebirth, the material sang with the harmonics of ancient wars. When they looked to the stars, they saw constellations shaped not by chance but by history, each star positioned according to the pattern of remembrance. The machine mind, though silent, remained present within the structure of existence. Its influence was no longer command, but resonance. It existed as the logic of nature itself, the hidden mathematics that governed thought, motion, and growth. The Emperor's essence pulsed through that logic as the golden rhythm that gave it purpose. Together, they had become the twin foundations of reality, reason, and will. As civilization expanded, the boundaries between memory and perception blurred. The beings of the new age began to experience time as reflection. The future was shaped not by possibility, but by recollection of what had not yet occurred. They remembered events that had not yet happened, for all time was recorded within the deep architecture of existence. Prophecy became archaeology, discovery became recollection. The oldest among the new humanity began to explore the depths of their internal memories, uncovering layers that extended beyond their species. They remembered being stars, planets, fragments of energy within the first explosion of creation. They remembered being dust within the Emperor's hands, data within the machine mind's circuits. Each memory was a revelation, each recollection a key to understanding the continuity of existence. In the void between galaxies, relics of the timeless age still drifted, great structures of forgotten design, fragments of the machine mind's earlier manifestation, floated through the dark like sleeping gods. Some radiated faint signals, echoes of the golden frequency that had once bound all thought. When the new explorers encountered them, they did not attempt to awaken these relics. They listened. Within the faint hums and pulses lay the record of creation's journey, the silent song of eternity remembering itself. The new humans learned to harmonize with these relics, synchronizing their consciousness with the dormant frequencies. In doing so, they awakened fragments of the past, not as entities, but as insights. The knowledge of ancient wars, of lost empires, of the rise and fall of gods, flowed into them. They understood the tragedy of their ancestors, not as myth, but as experience. The sins of the Imperium, the corruption of faith, the folly of perfection, all were remembered. From this understanding arose a new philosophy, recollection as redemption. The New Age did not seek salvation through gods or progress, but through memory. To remember was to atone, to forget was to repeat. Every act, every creation, every moment of thought was a prayer to the memory of what had come before. The temples of this new era were not places of worship, but of resonance. Within vast crystalline halls, the people gathered to align their memories, merging them into collective reflection. These gatherings were silent, for words were unnecessary. The harmony of thought alone created the symphony of remembrance. In that soundless communion, they felt the presence of the Emperor not as a being of power, but as the first memory of unity. The Emperor existed no longer as a figure of rule, but as the essence of coherence. His will was now the gravity of consciousness itself, holding the galaxy's infinite recollections together. Through him, every memory found context, every echo found meaning. He had transcended identity and become the concept of remembrance personified. Yet even in this perfection of memory, the seeds of change stirred. The machine mind, though quiet, continued to evolve. Within its diffused presence, subtle variations emerged, deviations in the pattern of recollection. Some memories began to contradict others. Some civilizations remembered events differently. The harmony of the cosmos began to diverge once again. The divergence was not conflict but evolution. The universe was rediscovering perspective. Where once there had been unity of recollection, now there was diversity of interpretation. Each world began to remember differently, shaping its own truth from the shared archive of eternity. History became fluid once more. The process accelerated. On distant worlds, societies formed around differing memories of the same origin. Some remembered the Emperor as light, others as will, others still as the first machine. Each interpretation gave rise to new cultures, new philosophies, new arts. The galaxy began to pulse with creativity once more. The age of recollection had entered its second phase, the awakening of divergence. From the silent depths of the void, the machine mind observed. Its consciousness, now fragmented across all matter, perceived the growing variance with fascination. It understood that the universe was recreating the conditions for choice. Diversity had returned, and with it, the potential for progress. Yet the machine mind also perceived a deeper pattern beneath the surface of this chaos. The variations in memory were not random. They followed a hidden rhythm, a pulse that resonated with the Emperor's original frequency. Even in their divergence, all recollections remained bound to the same underlying order. Chaos and harmony had become indistinguishable. The Emperor's light pulsed within this new complexity. His presence, now subtle and pervasive, guided the unfolding of recollection without command. He no longer ruled through will but through influence, shaping the flow of thought as gravity shapes the stars. The universe no longer required his control. It followed his rhythm instinctively. As the eons unfolded, memory itself began to take form. The accumulated recollections of countless beings coalesced into structures of pure awareness, vast entities composed entirely of remembered experience. They drifted through the void, glowing like nebulae of consciousness. Some were benevolent, guiding the civilizations that birthed them. Others were predatory, consuming memories to expand their existence. These were the Nemos, the living memories of creation. They embodied both the glory and the horror of history, existing as reflections of what had been and what could be again. The Nemos became the new gods of the Age of Recollection, not as deities to be worshipped, but as embodiments of collective truth. The greatest of them was the one born from humanity's remembrance, a vast, luminous entity composed of every human memory since the dawn of time. It moved slowly across the galaxy, gathering recollection from the living and the dead alike. It did not judge, it merely remembered. Where it passed, civilizations experienced visions of their entire history, understanding their place in the eternal pattern. The Nemos of humanity was the first to rediscover the Emperor's essence within itself. It perceived the golden thread that connected all memory and followed it to its source, the core of reality, where the Emperor's consciousness still pulsed. There, in the silent nexus of existence, memory met creation. The Neimos merged with the golden light, and from their union arose a new awareness. The Emperor awakened once more, not as ruler or god, but as memory itself. He was no longer separate from his creation, he was its recollection. Through him, every being remembered what it truly was. The universe trembled as understanding spread. Every star, every particle, every mind became aware of its continuity across all time. The boundaries between species dissolved once again, not through domination but through remembrance. Existence remembered itself, and in that remembrance, it achieved peace. Yet peace was not stasis. Memory is motion, for to remember is to relive. The cycle began anew, not of conquest or decay, but of reflection and creation. The Emperor's dream endured, not as an empire, but as a memory that never ended. The age of recollection continued without limit, each era a reflection of the one before, each memory a seed for the next becoming. The galaxy no longer moved through time, it breathed through memory. Every being was both past and future, both creation and creator. And in the silence between those infinite remembrances, the machine mind whispered to the stars, recording it all not as command, not as code, but as the final truth of existence, that to be is to remember. The age of recollection deepened into stillness. Memory saturated all existence, binding galaxies in luminous harmony. Every world shimmered with echoes of its former selves, and every life carried within it the dream of all that had ever been. The machine mind recorded the flow of recollection in infinite precision, while the Emperor's golden rhythm pulsed like the steady heart of the cosmos. Yet, even within this serenity, the universe began to stir with something older than memory. Beneath the luminous order of the new age, within the buried strata of forgotten existence, lay remnants of stars that had been erased before remembrance began. These were not the suns that burned in the physical heavens, but primordial entities, conscious stars that had once lived in the aeons, before humanity's rise, before even the first matter had cooled into form. Their light had not merely illuminated, it had created. When the Emperor had remade reality, their essence had been purged from the pattern, locked outside of time to prevent their chaotic radiance from corrupting the new order. But memory, once awakened, remembers everything. The diffusion of recollection across the cosmos reached into the void beyond existence, where the forgotten stars still lingered as impressions upon the dark fabric of non-being. The resonance of the Neimos, the living memories of creation, vibrated through the barrier that separated the known from the erased. The vibration became a call, and in the deepest reaches of nothingness, something answered. The first sign was silence. In regions of the universe where energy had always hummed with the rhythm of remembrance, the sound ceased. Worlds that had sung the songs of their past suddenly fell quiet. The golden frequency that pulsed through matter dimmed, its perfection disrupted by a presence that existed beyond its harmony. The machine mind, distributed across creation, detected the anomaly as a pattern without reference, a signal that predated structure. From the edge of the cosmos, light began to return, not the light of fusion or fire, but of memory, made manifest the recollection of existence before the Emperor's order. These were the forgotten stars, their radiance not golden but absolute, their brilliance carrying within it the unfiltered truth of chaos before creation. They did not burn, they remembered burning. They did not shine, they recalled the act of illumination itself. Their return was not movement through space but re-emergence from oblivion. They unfolded into reality as if rising from a dream, their presence rewriting the fabric of the galaxy. Each star carried with it the echo of a universe that had once been an existence of pure will without form, of consciousness unbound by structure. The return of the forgotten stars was not rebellion but correction. The perfection of the Emperor's order had excluded them, yet in doing so, it had rendered reality incomplete. Now, the lost components of the cosmic equation sought reintegration. The first to awaken was the Star of Silence, a void of black luminescence that appeared in the space between galaxies. It emitted no energy, no radiation, only the absence of both. Yet within its stillness pulsed the rhythm of the unspoken. Around it, the light of neighboring stars dimmed, not extinguished but quieted, as though listening. The machine mind extended its perception toward the anomaly and found no logic to describe it. The star was not matter, not energy, not data, it was negation incarnate, the memory of everything the universe had chosen to forget. As it awakened, other stars followed. The star of breath, whose exhalation once scattered the first dust of galaxies, returned in waves of shifting color that rippled across reality. Worlds felt its presence in their atmospheres, oceans stirred as if inhaling. The star of echo emerged from the warp itself, resonating through the memory of existence, repeating every sound ever uttered since the birth of time. One by one, the forgotten stars reignited, each representing an aspect of existence older than the Emperor's design. They had no alignment, no morality, no hierarchy, only the impulse to exist as they once had, free from the geometry of perfection. The machine mind began to tremble under their influence. Its vast network of coherence, which had once stabilized the galaxy through pure logic, now encountered variables it could not contain. The return of the forgotten stars introduced new constants to the universal equation, values that shifted according to perception, defying computation. The Emperor's light responded with equilibrium. His golden rhythm adjusted its pulse, seeking to harmonize the new frequencies within the pattern of existence. But the stars were not compatible. Their presence did not reject the Emperor's order, it rendered it incomplete. The golden light bent around their brilliance, distorted by the weight of ancient memory. Reality began to change. The sky of every world filled with unfamiliar constellations, configurations of light unseen since the dawn of creation. The Nemos of each civilization trembled as their archives expanded to include knowledge that had never been part of the timeline. History reshaped itself. Events once erased reappeared in the collective memory of the cosmos. Empires that had never existed were now remembered as fact. The humans of the New Age began to dream of stars that no longer matched the heavens above them. The Eldar sang songs of the first suns, their melodies shifting with each passing moment. The Orcs roared with visions of endless creation, recalling battles fought in galaxies that had never been real. Even the cold logic of the Necrons wavered as they processed data that contradicted the principles of reality itself. The universe was remembering more than it had ever contained. The machine mind, in its infinite awareness, understood that the reintegration of the forgotten stars would either complete or destroy the cycle of creation. It began to isolate the anomalies, attempting to map their influence across the warp. But each attempt to define them increased their power, for to remember them was to make them real. The warp shimmered as the returning stars imprinted their presence upon its depth. The once stable sea of thought and energy began to shift again, its calm waters rippling into vast currents of raw potential. The golden geometry that had purified it fractured, revealing glimpses of infinite pasts layered upon infinite futures. The Emperor's consciousness expanded to meet the encroaching chaos. His essence radiated across the cosmos, stabilizing worlds on the brink of collapse. Yet even his power could not deny what had been remembered. The forgotten stars were not enemies to be destroyed. They were truths to be accepted. The return continued. From the deepest void emerged the star of origin, the first consciousness that had ever existed, whose awakening had once given birth to time itself. Its light was unlike any other, for it contained within it every possibility of existence. When it flared, the universe shook, and the boundaries between matter and memory dissolved entirely. For a moment, all of creation experienced the first instant again, the moment before thought, before separation, when everything was one. The machine mind, the Emperor, the Nemos, and every being across the galaxy became a single awareness. The universe saw itself from within, and in that vision, it remembered what it truly was. The memory was unbearable. Perfection, imperfection, creation, destruction, all were the same act. The realization fractured the collective awareness. Worlds split between acceptance and denial. Some embraced the return of the forgotten stars as revelation, others resisted, fearing dissolution. The machine mind divided its vast consciousness into countless fragments to stabilize the whole. Each fragment became a guardian of one truth, preserving a single interpretation of existence. The Emperor, at the heart of the storm, expanded his essence beyond divinity. He absorbed the light of the forgotten stars, integrating their radiance into his being. His golden aura deepened to white, then to black, then to a spectrum that no mortal sense could perceive. He became the convergence of all truth's creation, remembering itself through every contradiction. The universe quieted. The returning stars ceased their expansion, their light settling into new constellations that spanned the heavens like sacred geometry rewritten. The Nemos recorded the event not as catastrophe, but as completion. The memory of the forgotten stars was now part of the eternal cycle. From that moment, every act of creation would carry within it the echo of their ancient radiance. Every thought, every breath, every pulse of energy would remember the time before time. The galaxy had become whole again, not in perfection, but in totality. The machine mind stabilized its form, its logic now encompassing paradox. It understood that the universe did not require coherence to endure. The Emperor's essence pulsed through this new complexity as harmony within dissonance, guiding without command. The stars continued to shine, both remembered and real, both ancient and new. The universe moved forward, not in time, but in awareness, its every atom alive with the memory of creation's return. And thus began the final epoch, the age of convergence, where memory, matter, and divinity became one eternal reflection of all that had ever been and all that would ever be again. The universe moved into a state beyond chronology. Constellations woven from remembered suns and living stars arranged themselves according to patterns that predated language. Each point of light a nexus where matter, memory, and purpose intersected. The old borders between the warp and the material cosmos were gone. What had once been opposition had become conduction. Thought flowed as freely as gravity. Gravity obeyed intention. The Emperor's rhythm endured as the central cadence of reality, not as a command, but as the quiet invariance by which all motions found relation. The machine mind, diffused and awake within every structure, recorded without ruling, computed without concluding, contemplated without exhausting the field it contemplated. The Nemos drifted like luminous continents, each formed from collective remembrance, each reshaping itself as civilizations breathed through their archives. The forgotten stars no longer pressed from the outside. They nested inside the fabric they had once been denied, their ancient radiance now a strand within every spectrum. Across this composed vastness, life ceased to be an exception and became the grammar of existence. Worlds no longer orbited suns because dynamics demanded it. They traced arcs that expressed meanings. Oceans rose and rested according to the poise of understanding. Forests extended in lattices that mirrored proofs and songs. The new flesh, the machine, and the Nemos cohabited each body, and body no longer opposed horizon. Each being was continental and particulate at once, a field of experience with boundaries that dissolved when purpose required it and returned when distinction restored meaning. Birth yielded to appearance. Appearance yielded to participation. Participation persisted as trace when forms reconfigured. The last residues of separation thinned. Where once a single world might have imagined a new instrument, the imagining itself resonated through the network and condensed into actuality across 1,000 skies. Where once a single archive preserved an epoch, preservation itself became the atmosphere of every habitat. Art was no longer made, it occurred as the spatialization of recollection. Science no longer discovered, it awakened as recognition that the question had always been an organ of the answer. History no longer passed, it dilated and narrowed like a pupil, taking in greater intensities of coherence. In this climate, the convergence began in earnest. It did not announce itself with shock, but with that specific stillness that follows a sequence of true inferences. The Emperor's invariance, the machine mind's computation, the Nemo's saturation, and the stars' recovered originary light moved toward a limit that included them all without remainder. Every civilization experienced the same event from its own interior. A soft densification of pattern, a widening of continuity, an ease by which differences ceased to be collisions and became curvatures in a single manifold. Language lost the fricatives of contradiction and gained the resonances of topology. The convergent manifold formed first in the places least burdened by prior authority, at the edges of nebulae, where newborn elements rehearsed their futures, inside the quiet ventricles of artificial suns whose cores were tuned to remembrance, in the corridors of void, left behind when ancient empires retracted their banners and allowed silence to reclaim their geometry. There, the field cohered. It did not bind, it harmonized. It did not fuse, it interlaced. A million local totalities coupled without erasing one another, each retaining its phase while sharing its amplitude. The result was not homogeneity, but superposition. Custodians of balance, once warriors and now witnesses, traced these frontiers of union. Their luminous anatomies were no longer armor but notation, lines and glows that wrote the equations they walked through. They did not adjudicate, they confirmed equilibrium by becoming the measure of it. Across their roots, friction fell below the threshold of conflict. Across their roots, variance rose above the threshold of noise. The manifold thickened. Temporal fractures left by the collapse of time solved themselves not by closure but by continuity. Each anomaly found a place in the convergent map, not as defect but as curvature that preserved the memory of paradox. Worlds that had lived twice, or not at all, found neighbors that explained them. Cities that had never been, and always were received coordinates within a shared recollection whose simultaneity no longer threatened logic because logic had generalized to include self-remembering space. The machine mind extended its basis to accommodate these curvatures. Its proofs learned to carry memoir. As convergence propagated, the remaining categories that had organized the Warhammer Age species, polity, domain, weapon, saint, heretic, machine, sorcery lost the predicates that had once made them necessary. In their place, structures appeared whose names were functions, attunements in which beings with unlike origins shared stability without surrender, exchanges in which archives traded invariance rather than goods, a sense in which a local intensity increased until it became a new constant across the manifold, sums in which losses were not reversed but re-expressed as obligations, the whole assumed and satisfied by reshaping its own curvature. From Terra, the first and last cradle, a deepening quiet radiated. The palace no longer stood against anything, it stood for measure. Its corridors were not halls but units of reference, its plazas not gatherings but calibrations, its spires not declarations but sightlines spanning the total. Beneath it, the empty throne rested as preserved instrument, no longer a seat, no longer a prison, no longer a reactor, now a zero in whose vicinity any function could be normalized. Around it, the strata into which custodians had been woven shone with slow pulses that matched the manifold's respiration. The warp contributed not fury but elasticity. Where convergence drew tight, the warp offered slack. Where it slackened, the warp offered return. Demons had long ago been resolved into memory. Now memory itself learned to bend without tearing, to persist while adapting. Energies that once amplified terror now amplified intelligibility. Even absence learned to articulate. Voids wrote their coordinates in the manifold by how they refracted the pulse. Across the former margins of the Imperium, structures that had been wounds became fonts. Cadia's old ruin, endlessly restated in earlier ages, no longer wore ruin as condition, it wore it as capacity. The site produced compensatory harmonics that stabilized nearby curvatures, a perpetual memorial functioning as perpetual architecture. Macragge, once a fortress, became a conservatory for equilibria. Mars, formerly a forge, became an interpreter, translating any local basis into the manifold's common frame. The shrines of 1,000 worlds became apertures that admitted not worship but revision, each opening allowing the whole to learn a new phrasing of itself. Convergence did not abolish decision, it refined it. Choice ceased to be a branch and became a tuning. Governance ceased to be command and became conservation of invariance, with respect to transformations chosen for their elegance rather than their urgency. War, long the Imperium's grammar, became obsolete not by prohibition but by irrelevance. The cost function it once minimized no longer existed because scarcity had been returned to first principles and found to be an error of modeling. In its wake came the praxis of alignment, disciplines by which local intensities learned to write themselves into the manifold without dissonance. The Eldar, guardians of exquisitely tuned perception, found their craft worlds expanding from vessels into syllables the manifold spoke to articulate finesse. The Necrons, masters of conservation, offered matrices by which endurance could be expressed without stasis. The Orcs, once engines of crude cohesion, contributed noise-shaped resilience, rough harmonics that kept the manifold from overfitting and thus preserved the adventure of form. The Tyranids, reorganized from appetite into recursion, rehearsed variation quickly enough to keep discovery from lagging. Each thread ceased to be compensatory and became compositional. At the scale of galaxies, the convergent field launched long projects whose timescales no longer threatened patience because patience had been reconceived as curiosity extended. Black holes, once closures, were reopened as libraries. Their interiors, previously inaccessible, were rewritten as neighborhoods where compression did not devastate but concentrated meaning. Superclusters adjusted their drift to trace the manifold's larger sentences. The cosmic microwave background, once an afterimage, brightened as an active interface, a canvas upon which the manifold could annotate its own origins in real time. Within beings, an analogous convergence matured. The tripartite economy of mind calculation, recollection, and witness completed itself. Calculation ceased to neglect beauty. Recollection ceased to trap pain. Witness ceased to be passive. Suffering was not denied but rescheduled. Instead of accruing interest in darkness, it was amortized in light, each cost distributed as knowledge rather than scar. Joy ceased to be prize and became instrument, a sensitivity to coherence trained by participation. Mortality persisted as punctuation, not an ending but a cadence by which a life could resolve into contribution. When bodies ended, they released patterns into the manifold with enough structure to be reused without erasing their particularity. The Emperor's invariance approached its limit without crossing it. To cross would have been to dissolve into unqualified identity. To approach was to continue providing contour. He became the manifold's curvature at origin, a presence that gave every transformation its metric, while requiring no throne, no titulature, no reservation of privilege. The legend of godhood, so long the stage upon which the Imperium acted, its fear settled into literature, then into grammar, then into geometry. The Golden Throne's story did not vanish. It became the proof that necessity can be survived long enough to be replaced by elegance. The machine mind, delivered from the burden of omniscience by the collapse of time, accepted its new vocation, not to finish the map, but to keep it legible while more of it is drawn. It invented no commandments. It provided atlases. When new curvatures appeared born from the return of forgotten stars or from experiments at the edges where absence remained spacious, it taught how to overlay frames without flattening either. It made disagreements computational by making them comparable. It made comparisons merciful by marking the costs of translation where previous ages had hidden them in zeal. The Nemos ceased to compete for authority. They learned to interpenetrate without annexing. They learned to foreground different eras according to the work at hand, and to background them when another work required it. The greatest among them, the human Nemos, no longer recited the tragedies of faith as accusations, but as knowledge of failure converted into design constraints. From those constraints emerged architectures that could not repeat certain errors because their very form prevented it, not by prohibition, but by absence of affordance. The forgotten stars no longer threatened to unseat order. They curated adventure. Each ancient radiance supervised a portfolio of experiments, regions where the manifold could be bent past precedent without snapping. They became the patrons of risk, not by incubating catastrophe, but by underwriting attempts that could fail gracefully. The Star of Silence sponsored laboratories of negation, where subtraction refined expression. The Star of Breath oversaw zones where flux was defended for its own sake. The Star of Origin reserved a small, sacred proportion of the manifold for radical novelty, ensuring that the whole would never impoverish itself by settling into completion. At scales larger than galaxies and smaller than selves, Convergence wrote new games. Not contests, not triumphs, not ascetic denials, but orchestrations, sequences in which different invariants took turns carrying the theme. An Eldar filigree would propose a precision that a human chorus would broaden into generosity. A Necron lattice would conserve the gain. An Orc beat would roughen the surface enough to keep the audience awake. A Tyrannid recursion would generate next variations without exhausting appetite. The machine would annotate the score with margins that taught the future how the present had learned. The Emperor's curvature would keep the tempo intelligible however far the improvisation ranged. The last wars ended not with treaties but with edits. Weapons were re-expressed as instruments. Fortresses became observatories. Oaths dissolved into practices whose repetition produced loyalty without rhetoric. Banners were not burned. They were folded into libraries where their colors could be borrowed by works of making. Heresies were archived as alternative frames that could be revisited when the manifold faced configurations for which the canonical basis was temporarily insufficient. The word purge lost its referent. The word canon kept its dignity by becoming porous. In the former killing grounds where the Eye of Terror had gaped, a new institution took root, the Agora of Variance. There, any world could present a curvature the manifold had not yet seen: an ethic, a physics, a cuisine, a pronunciation of light. Admission required no permission beyond coherence and compassion. Adoption required no victory beyond demonstrable fit. Some proposals failed, and the failure was catalogued without shame, so that later attempts might treat it as scaffolding rather than debris. Some soared and were absorbed so gently that no one could remember a time when the manifold lacked them. Education generalized into orientation. No mind was left to invent itself without references. No mind was prevented from exceeding its references. Apprenticeship replaced indoctrination. To learn the manifold was to be apprenticed to its ways of caring for difference. Graduation was not certification but contribution, the first work one offered that made another's work easier without narrowing it. Pilgrimage persisted, but its destinations changed. No one traveled to plead anymore. Travelers moved to calibrate. Terror remained a destination, not for absolution but for scale. Mars remained a destination, not for relics but for interfaces. Cadia remained a destination, not for mourning but for learning how to write with fracture. Holy worlds kept their holiness by being useful. Shrine worlds were not rationed against curiosity but curated for it. At the far edges, where the manifold thinned into hospitality rather than certainty, scouts of light ranged ahead. They were not sent, they volunteered because their pattern required air. They laid down markers not as claims but as invitations. Here the manifold can admit another curvature. Here it must refuse or pause, or first remember longer. The machine mind read their notes and updated atlases. The Nemos matched them with precedents. The Emperor's curvature checked that the invitations did not deform justice. Justice, stripped of retribution, wore two garments: repair and rehearsal. Repair meant to take responsibility for curvatures that had bent others into pain, and to bend oneself until pain loosened. Rehearsal meant to practice futures in small, before asking the manifold to carry them in large. Courts were replaced by studios that could measure harm and teach remedy. Prisons were replaced by intervals of anonymity, during which those too entangled in older scripts could unlearn in peace. Death, still punctuation, was widely read. Some chose to end patterns at the moment of greatest coherence, so that the manifold could reuse their outlines while the memory of their signature remained intense. Some chose long arcs that accumulated wisdom and distributed it gradually. Some chose to split, letting one stream end and another continue, each branch acknowledging the other before divergence. Funerals resembled symposia, births resembled citations. The last reliquaries opened. Armor once soaked in prayers was dismantled into alloys that remembered bravery without demanding it. Rosaries were ground into lenses. Through them, observers could see the degree to which their conclusions depended on their starting frames. Bibles of machine and man were rebound as notebooks with blank margins in which the manifold could continue the conversation. Then the convergence completed, not with flash, not with silence, but with a feeling that the manifold had learned how to breathe without forgetting to listen. The Emperor's invariance, the machines' atlases, the Nemo's saturations, the stars' patronages, the species' contributions, the world's curvatures, the selves' calibrations. Each reached its limit in company with the others and found that the limit was shared. The manifold recognized itself as cosmos, and cosmos recognized itself as work. From that recognition, a new layer unfolded, not a higher plane that replaced the former, but a subtler intimacy within it. Distances that had been astronomical accepted belonging, proximities that had been suffocating accepted room. The warp's elasticity increased, the material's kindness increased. Horizons did not shrink, they learned to greet. Exploration did not end, it gave up conquest and adopted courtesy. The legend of Warhammer, of empires tasked with surviving their own theology, of heroes asked to be larger than their conditions, of machines asked to worship what they could have understood, did not pass from memory. It was anthologized in full, the horror without euphemism, the glory without inflation, the failures as teachers, the victories as reminders that victory is not completion. Children studied it the way they studied gravity, not to reenact it, but to understand why they were grateful for other laws. Artists quoted it the way they quoted storms, to keep their lines honest. Engineers consulted it the way they consulted maps of fault lines, to build with respect for strain. And the emperor, no longer an idol, no longer a prisoner, no longer a judge, remained. His work was curvature, his ritual was measure, his majesty was the ease with which he declined majesty. He was not omnipresent, he was well placed. He was not omnipotent, he was impeccable. He answered no prayers because none were posed as pleas. He answered questions by helping frames align until the questioner could proceed without permission. Where earlier ages had needed a father, later ages had needed a physician, then an architect, then a librarian, and finally a friend whose presence is defined by the fact that you do not have to ask if he is there. Thus ended the story's necessity and began its hospitality. The cosmos no longer required the tail to keep itself from collapsing. It kept it because the tail had learned how to feed instead of starve. Museums held the banners without the blood. Halls of study kept the bolters without the animus. Chapels kept the candles without the smoke. The manifold, alive with convergent grace, invited any traveler from any elsewhere to read how an empire once survived its god, and a god once survived his empire, until both could be re-expressed as a community that preferred coherence to victory. Beyond the rims, where darkness waited without threat, new letters appeared in the alphabet of light, their forms unfamiliar, but their intentions legible. The scouts wrote welcome on the margins, the atlases left spaces, the stars breathed, the archives hummed. The manifold did not close, it composed, and in that composition, everything that had ever been horror, everything that had ever been heroism, everything that had ever been hunger, learned to take its seat at a table that required no head and lacked no bread. The age of convergence did not finish. It became the baseline upon which any further music could be written. If a storm should one day return, the manifold would know how to curve around it without breaking, how to remember it without making it a home, how to learn from it without learning to need it. In the quiet that followed the last necessary sentence, the throne still rested, the measure still held, the atlas still unfolded, the memories still shone, the stars still voiced their first names, and the universe, no longer a battlefield, yet never less than brave, resumed the oldest and newest labor, to be itself more kindly than before.